So regardless of what type of mating strategy the snail has, after eggs are fertilized, they're laid through the gonopore, which is the opening to the reproductive tract. It has this generic name because, again, they're often hermaphroditic, so that gonopore might release either eggs or sperm or both. The eggs are usually covered in mucus to protect them and keep them from drying out, and often that mucus hardens into a protective shell or casing. Snail eggs can be really variable in how they look. If you've ever seen these strange spiral structures on the beach and wondered what they are, they're actually the egg casings of whelks, which are a carnivorous sea snail. If you've never seen these, keep an eye out for them if you're ever near the ocean. They're really common on beaches. Once the eggs hatch, they go through 2 larval stages before they become an adult snail. The first stage is a trochophore larva. This is a small, simple larva with cilia that it uses to swim around. Remember, snails are in the bilateria, so at some point in their development, they have bilateral symmetry. This trochophore larva is the only place where we see that before they have that torsion. That trochophore larva then develops into a veliger, which may look a little bit more snail-like to you. The veliger has a structure called the velum, which is basically just a chamber lined in cilia to control water flow. It uses the velum to swim and also to filter feed. It's also during this stage that torsion occurs. So we can see that twisted anatomy in the veliger, but again, not in the trochophore. In species that have become detorted, the veliger will still have some torsion, but it'll be lost by the time it develops into an adult snail. Then the veliger develops into a juvenile snail, and it'll have to go through several juvenile stages of growth before becoming an adult that can reproduce. You probably already know that snails move by crawling along on their foot, but they aren't just sliding. They need a way to generate that forward momentum. They do this by creating waves in the foot, almost like taking tiny steps forward. Their pedal retractor muscles contract and relax in waves, kind of like doing the worm in breakdancing. The pedal retractor muscles are the same muscles that retract the foot into the shell, hence the name. Pedal means foot, like podiatrist. All that mucus on the foot also helps the foot glide as the snail moves forward in these tiny waves. Some snails also use their foot to move in other ways. For example, they might dig or burrow by scooping substrate with their foot. But probably the coolest example of unusual locomotion in gastropods are the nudibranchs, or sea slugs. These guys don't just crawl around on the substrate. A lot of them are actually free-swimming gastropods, and many of them can swim very well. Their foot has extensions called parapodia that they can use like fins to swim. Nudibranchs are often very brightly colored and beautiful as they swim through the ocean. So go ahead and pause and click the link in the slides if you want to see what that looks like. A lot of the nudibranchs are not super efficient swimmers, like the one you may have just seen if you watched the video. But there are some, like the sea angel, that are entirely pelagic. So they spend all of their time living and swimming in the open water, never going down to the seafloor. Sea angels have a set of parapodia that look like literal wings, hence the name. And they're really strange looking animals. Pause and click the link in the slides to see those wings in action. Nudibranchs in general are really interesting and strange animals. They're often very brightly colored, so they're absolutely beautiful to look at. Often these colors are to warn predators not to eat them because they produce defensive chemicals. But they can also help camouflage them with colorful corals and sponges. When we talked about detorsion, I mentioned that nudibranchs lose torsion as adults. So their veliger has torsion, but the adults do not. The veliger larva also has a shell, but they lose it before becoming adults. Another fun fact is that nudibranchs actually can feed on cnidarians like hydrozoans. Not only can they withstand the stings from those cnidarian nematocysts, they can collect them and use them to defend themselves from predators. So if you want to learn some more about nudibranchs and see some of the wild colors and forms they come in, pause, go to the lecture slides, and check out this video. So gastropods are a really diverse and abundant group of invertebrates. Let's talk about their ecological roles and interactions with humans. One of their most important roles is as a food source for larger animals. Tons of animals rely on snails and slugs. From birds to fish, reptiles and amphibians, small mammals, and even other invertebrates. But when they're not being eaten, gastropods also play important roles as herbivores, detritivores, and predators in their food webs. Humans eat gastropods too. Not as much here in the US, but they're common in many other parts of the world. Gastropods and mollusks were actually a really important source of protein in early human evolutionary history. But there are some ways gastropods can negatively affect us, one of which is as serving as reservoirs or alternative hosts for parasites that can infect humans. Schistosomiasis is a disease caused by an infection with a parasitic flatworm. It has a complex life cycle that involves completing some of its development inside an aquatic snail. You don't have to worry about all the life stages here in this life cycle, but focus on the fact that snails are a host in this cycle and how humans become infected. So again, part of this life cycle takes place inside these aquatic snails. After that stage of development, the flatworm's larvae leave the snail and enter a free swimming stage where they swim around in the water looking for their next host, which could be a human. They penetrate into the skin of humans who are swimming or walking through the water and infect them. That flatworm then gets into the bloodstream where it circulates and reproduces. Eventually, it embeds itself in the bladder and sometimes other tissues in the human host. Symptoms of schistosomiasis include malaise or a general feeling of being unwell. It often causes a distended or swollen abdomen and abdominal pain, especially in children. Because it becomes embedded in the bladder, it can cause bladder damage and lead to blood in the urine. And oftentimes it also causes a rash to form on the skin. If it's caught early, schistosomiasis can be treated. But sometimes that's not the case and it becomes a chronic infection before the person either knows they have it or has access to treatment. Chronic infections can be much more serious. They may result in cancers, such as bladder cancer, and they can also cause loss of cognitive ability. Fortunately, the parasites that cause schistosomiasis and their snail hosts are not found here in the US, but this is a huge medical concern in regions where both species are present. Its prevalence is highest in Africa, but it can also be found in some parts of South America and Asia. Another way gastropods can negatively impact us is by affecting our crops and food supply. If you know any gardeners, you may have heard them complain about slugs damaging their gardens. There are some herbivorous gastropods, especially slugs, that are major crop pests. They tend to affect low-growing crops because they're easy for them to access, like strawberries. But some are willing to even climb up into citrus trees and damage those fruits. This monster of a snail, the giant African snail, is a crop pest that has become invasive in many parts of the world. It's originally from Africa, but has spread to much of South America and many parts of Asia. And you can imagine a snail this big can do some serious damage. It's a voracious herbivore that can eat or destroy a lot of a crop once it's present. But it's not just feeding that damages the crop. It can also vector plant disease. In addition to that, once it invades an area, it starts to outcompete native snails, causing their populations to decline. And to add insult to injury, it also carries a parasitic nematode that can infect humans and cause meningitis. You may have noticed when I showed this range map before for the African giant snail that there's actually some points here in the US, in Florida. It was first found in Florida in the 1960s, and it took 10 years of work and about $1 million to eradicate it. However, it was then accidentally reintroduced in 2011, and it took another 10 years to eradicate it again. So that's it for gastropods. I'll see you in class on Monday. We'll keep talking about the rest of the groups of mollusks that we're going to go over. We'll also talk about the exams and that optional exam review assignment then. So I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll see you Monday.